do. You guys going through the list here, right? So you've got what are the major supplies to the brain in terms of vasculature? Where does it come from? From outside of the cranial vault?
Internal carotid.
Internal carotid, and what's the other?
Vertebral artery.
Vertebral. How does the vertebral artery get to inside the cranial vault?
Through the hypoglossal. No, you like that word. No, I'm pointed here, but I mean back here.
No. So it's traveling up the neck through what?
Spinal cord. Yeah, right. Not the
vertebral foramen.
Transverse foramen of the individual vertebra, right? And then it goes through the foramen magnum, right? At the base of the skull.
The canal's right there.
So when you take this brain out, here's the cross section of the spinal cord, right? So this would be the foramen magnum. And this little stump right here on this side, this is vertebral artery coming in through the foramen magnum. The stump has been picked off, so this is a limitation of this particular model.
Oh, okay.
But let's just put my pipe cleaner here, and it kind of looks like the vertebral artery coming up alongside the spinal cord through the foramen magnum, right? So this is vertebral, that is hypothetically vertebral, but this is also vertebral. Okay, this side and this side. The first branch, as it comes through the foramen magnum, is going to the posterior cranial fossa, and that's these two, here and here, right? What's going to supply? What's in this posterior cranial fossa?
cerebellum.
Bingo, right? It's posterior, it's on the inferior aspect, and it's supplying the cerebellum, and it's an artery. So that's your pica, posterior inferior cerebellar artery. This guy right here.
It's rather descriptive.
Yes, it is. Now, before these two vertebral arteries unite, they give off another artery that's going to be supplying the anterior surface of this spinal cord. So what do you think this guy is called right here?
Spinal artery.
Anterior spinal artery. So there's the anterior spinal artery. So then, these vertebral arteries unite to form this big arterial channel. That's the basilar. The basilar runs across, or basilar.
Okay.
Your mileage may vary. Runs across the pons here, okay? And you should be able to see that in the brain sections that he's bringing in, okay? So this is basilar, or basilar. And then right after the two vertebrals unite, there's one more cerebellar artery. And that's this guy coming off here and here, and that's the superior cerebellar. So the pica and the ica are inferior cerebellar arteries. There's a single superior cerebellar arteries. So if he's using a model like this, the superior surface, these arterial branches here are going to be branches off of the superior cerebellum. Okay, so anything that's on this area is going to be superior cerebellar. And then this is posterior, inferior, and anterior inferior, okay? All right, next branch off of the basilar is this big branch. For some reason on this model it's huge. In real life it is not. But this branch going into the internal auditory meatus is the auditory / acoustic / labyrinthian artery, which I do not even think is on your list.
No.
But I wanted you guys to know what this is so you don't get confused if this happens to be one of the models that he puts a question in. You want to look at, you're concentrating on the first one here. The second one is labyrinthian. Then everything that's sort of colored in by years and years of students using pencils and pens, this would represent multiple branches that are going to supply the pons, and those would be pontine arteries, okay? Because this is a big area that needs a lot of blood supply. So this is the pons right here. All right. You know what, I screwed up. I screwed up. So you're going to have to edit that. This is ica, right? This is superior cerebellar.
Okay.
All right, so I apologize. I'm backwards. I got myself screwed up. This is vertebral. This is ica. This is pica. This is labyrinthian, basilar, and then this is superior cerebellar. So that's the one that is going to be supplying the superior aspect. Okay. Now we're into the area of the circle of Willis, and there's a number of pieces that have been broken off of this particular model. But this would be posterior cerebral, because there's 3 arteries that supply the cerebrum.
Okay.
Okay, so this would be the posterior branch. All of these branches would be posterior cerebral. We then have middle cerebral. As it's coming up into the brain here, it's actually internal carotid, and then the biggest branch that's going up into the brain itself is middle cerebral. So this is the distribution of the middle cerebral artery here. If you're looking at it from this side, these cut sections here would be middle cerebral. Okay, here you can make the argument that it's either internal carotid or middle cerebral, depending on how far down it has been cut. There is a communication between the middle cerebral and the posterior cerebral, and that's the posterior communicating artery here. Here it is on this side. Your posterior communicating has been broken off on this side.
So there's a pair of posterior communicating arteries?
Yes. Communicates here on one side and then on the other.
Okay.
So there's 2 posterior communicating.
Would the whole loop be considered posterior communicating, or
No, the whole
what
loop is
this
considered. The whole loop is considered the circle of Willis.
Okay.
So it's
Okay.
just between the middle.
Yes, it would be posterior communicating.
Okay.
There's an anterior communicating in between the 2 anteriors.
So there's only one
Okay.
anterior and there's 2 posteriors?
Yes, yes. Ask him to show you on the brains difference between posterior communicating and anterior communicating, because this kind of looks like this would be the posterior communicating, and it really isn't. It's this communication here and here. Okay, and anterior communicating is also not well depicted on here. You want to look on the brains, but it's usually in between the 2 anterior cerebrals. So the anterior cerebrals usually kind of like come off. There's one that comes off this way and one that comes off this way, and then they communicate right about here, and then they go off to their individual cerebral lobes. Okay? All right. So that's the arteries. The veins include your sinuses. The ones that are in parentheses are either cut or not readily visible. So this would be the superior sagittal sinus. And that's the one that's going to arc over in the dura mater. Then there's also an inferior sagittal sinus, which you can't really see, but that's formed at the edge, the free edge of the falx cerebri. Okay? The straight sinus then is formed by the union of the inferior sagittal sinus and the great vein of Balin, which you guys don't need to know or identify, but then it comes in right into this confluence of sinus like my fingernail is. So this cut region right here is an indication of the cut straight sinus. This whole area right here, where they're all converging, is the confluence of sinuses. Laterally or transversely coming out of the confluence are the transverse sinus. And then once the transverse sinus turns south and becomes S-shaped, is sigmoid sinus. And then it exits through the jugular foramen as the internal jugular vein. Okay? So it's transverse, 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 then sigmoid, jugular, internal jugular.
So this is sigmoid, right?
Yes. I'm sorry. This is sigmoid. So, sorry, because I was just following all the way down and it was hard for me to see. Yeah. So, and it's actually bigger than what's depicted on this particular skull base. All right. Sorry about the confusion with the.
So that's fine. It's perfect.
Can you edit that?